Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all arriving. Thank you very much for coming along this afternoon. We'll be underway within 1 minute. Just to say to make yourself comfortable, familiarize yourself with the controls down the bottom. They're a little bit different from a normal Zoom meeting. You might want to just check where your Q&A button is if you've got any questions that you want to throw up to the panel and to interact. But we'll be underway with our formal start in less than 1 minute. So thank you very much for attending. We look forward to getting into the session. Thank you, everyone. I'm Jeff from the Early Years Catalyst. It's really lovely to have you along with us today. I can see that there's lots of people arriving, so we'll probably have to come back and hit this message a few times to remind people about the session today and the structure of it. Today, we're really excited to be with you to just share some of the new research that's unearthed. And Jane Hunt, one of our co-chairs, will give the formal introduction in just 1 second. Just in terms of housekeeping, just noting this is a recorded webinar. We will share the recording with everyone who attends, and we'll just share it on the website, so you'll be free to share it elsewhere. This is a webinar, so there's a Q&A function. There's not a chat function. So there's not a chat that goes to everyone because we can't actually control who's in here. Anyone could register and pass that on. So just in terms of safety, we're just using a Q&A. And all we ask is that you post your questions in there. The panelists are all primed. If it's a quick answer, they'll answer there in the Q&A. Otherwise, we'll actually funnel them into a question and answer session at the end, and we'll make sure we hit all the key themes that come up. So as I say, we'll be underway shortly. Jane will give us a formal intro. We'll go into the body of the work from the team at TKI. They'll be introducing all the background and the information, and then we'll go to some questions. So if you do have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A slot down the bottom as you're traveling, as it comes up for you, because I think it's really interesting to see what people have and what thoughts are emerging. So can I throw now to you, Jane, one of our co-chairs, and Penny Dakin, our other co-chair, is actually going to wrap us up at the end. So nice double teaming. Well done. Over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Jeff. And on behalf of the Early Years Catalyst, welcome and thank you for joining us today for this webinar. I do want to start by acknowledging that we all meet on Aboriginal land. So I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And for those who live in Victoria, often we see in signs and elders teach us that Wominjeka is the word for welcome. And I recently learnt from one of the elders that it also means come with purpose. And I love that because it makes me really think about what I am bringing to country and what my purpose is. And today we have something that is incredibly important for all families, children in Australia. And it's really learning about the mental models that drive our service delivery systems, our policies, etc. So I wanted to also acknowledge the people on the webinar who have been part of the Early Years Catalyst work. There's many who have been engaged in mapping and understanding the collections of early childhood development systems in Australia at the moment, and also in the future, what those systems might look like if they were the most aspirational and effective for our children. And in that process, what we learned, or we realized, that there were mental models and narratives that were being held about children, about families, communities, and that these absolutely drive policy, funding allocations, service provision and design. And so the Early Years Catalyst wanted to really better understand what those mental models were as a first step in a more deeper change agenda. So what we did was we commissioned Telethon Kids Institute to undertake some research into those deeply held beliefs that absolutely shape our early childhood development system in Australia. And so I'm going to hand now to Amy from the Telethon Kids Institute team, and she's going to introduce the team and the work with you all and share it with you. So Amy, over to you.
Thanks, Jane, for that lovely introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. It's really wonderful to be here with you today and sharing what we have learned through a very rapid and dynamic deep dive. So let me just get my slides up for you. And I will introduce myself. So I am the head of the Early Neurodevelopment and Mental Health team here at Telethon Kids Institute in Western Australia. I'm a senior research fellow and also a 0 to 3 fellow, and I am one of the co-leads of this project. I'm also joined by Jada.
Hi everyone, I'm Jada Penny. I'm a Nyunga research assistant in the Early Neurodevelopment and Mental Health team. I work across a range of projects, but my interest is particularly in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children's health and wellbeing. And in this project, I've been focusing primarily on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lens to mental models and conditions in Australia. Before we proceed, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we are meeting on today. Nyala Karich Wajak Nyungamur, Kayan Karich Nijabuja.
And I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work. I wish to pay my deep respects to elders past and present and gratefully acknowledge the generous contribution of Aboriginal researchers, families and communities to the work that we do here at Telethon Kids Institute, and just to extend a warm welcome to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. I'd also like to introduce our wonderful team who've been working very hard with us on this project. So we have Adrian Gregory, who's here today, who's been keeping us all together. Yasmin Harmon-Smith, who will be leading the second stage of this project, which is looking at co-design. Rosemary Cahill, Frances Mitru, Renee Hallam and Karen Ford, as well as Will Copping, Alyssa Stromper, Helena Crabb, Jack Brett, Luke Vanderbeek and Donna Van Buren. And we'd also really like to extend our thanks to our consumer advisory group, who've had incredible input into this process, our professional advisory group, and everybody who's been part of our consultations, giving us very deep and rich insights into mental models, which at times have been kind of difficult conversations to have. And we really want to acknowledge that from the outset. So just to give you some background to this project, which many of you may already be familiar with, in late 2021, the Early Years Catalyst commissioned Orange Compass to undertake a very comprehensive systems mapping process to identify factors that are influencing the ECD outcomes in Australia and the systems that we have, and there are many of them. And what they found in this systems mapping process was a complex array of interconnected current state issues, how things are, as well as a set of desired state outcomes, so how things ideally could be. And in addition to those, they uncovered a range of possible leverage points to get us from how things are to how they potentially could be. And we absolutely can't go into all of the aspects of the current state that was uncovered during that systems mapping process, but I wanted to give you a visual diagram of this. And if you're interested in digging into it further, if you haven't already, it is on the Early Years Catalyst website. But what you can see here is this complex web of what has been termed government logic, service sector logic, market logic, care logic, child and family experience, deeply held societal beliefs, which is what we're going to be talking about, as well as reform logic. And this is, a lot to unpack, and we certainly don't have time to do that today, but I do encourage you to go and explore the reports and explore this interactive map through the website, because it's very, very interesting, and it kind of forms the background to the work that we have been doing. In terms of understanding the current state and understanding systems change generally, which we say systems change like it's something fairly straightforward. It's obviously not, and it is very complex. But this model really helps us to understand the different ways that we can look at achieving change and what is really required if we are serious about transformational systems change. So often when we talk about change, we talk about change at the structural, explicit level. We talk about changing policy, we talk about changing practices, and we talk about changing resource flows. So where does the money go? To a lesser extent, we talk about changing relationships and connections. These are things that are often assumed, as are the power dynamics that underpin relationships and whose voice gets heard in any given situation. And underpinning those dynamics is what we call the cultural level of change, and can also be thought of as the transformational level of change. And this is often implicit, and this is the level of mental models or cultural models, which is the focus of the work that we have been doing. So trying to unpack what are the mental models that are underpinning the current state of early child development systems and outcomes in Australia today, and how might we shift those? So what are mental models? As I mentioned, you may have heard the use of this term in some other work referred to as cultural models, but basically we can define mental models as deeply held societal beliefs or narratives that influence the way that we see the world, including our expectations, values, and norms. And it's important to emphasise that these are held at the level of society and culture. They're not necessarily what individuals believe, and they are often unstated. So this is really interesting when you're trying to interview and run focus groups about mental models, because mental models can often be outside of people's awareness. And it's really important to emphasise that they are not necessarily true. They are often reflective of stigma and bias, or reflective of the way that things have always been. They're certainly not necessarily something that you personally believe. And they can certainly be quite confronting. And this is particularly, we have seen this unfold through our consultation process, where even where mental models may not be necessarily something that we personally believe, they can still influence the way that we behave. And I think that's important to hold in mind as we start to unpack some of these. And with that in mind, I just wanted to guide people towards some norms about holding courageous conversations, which has been really important in our kind of the way that we've approached this work, but also as we start to unpack some of the implications and thinking about next steps. These are some norms that we would like just to kind of bring to the forefront of people's minds and to hold in mind as we go through the presentation today. So the first of these is to stay engaged and to make a conscious effort to remain morally, emotionally, intellectually and socially involved in the dialogue, even when we are experiencing discomfort. So acknowledging that discomfort is inevitable, especially when we're talking about equity and inequity. And as part of it, acknowledging discomfort, we really make a commitment to bringing issues out into the open despite experiencing that discomfort. We speak our truth and commit to being open about our thoughts and feelings, and not just saying what we think others want to hear. And again, we really appreciate the honesty and the vulnerability of our participants in going through this process, talking about mental models that they are aware of that may have been very impactful on their own lived experience, and certainly in cases where that's been very, very difficult. And we expect and accept non-closure. So becoming comfortable with uncertainty and not rushing to quick solutions, although I'm sure we all want them, but especially when we're talking about deep systemic bias and stigma, which really requires ongoing dialogue. And I will pause there to say we certainly see this work as a first step in an ongoing dialogue. It is not a kind of clear, wrapped up solution by any means, rather just opening up to see what are some of these mental models and some of the big picture issues that are influencing the early child development systems and outcomes as they are in Australia today. So why focus on changing mental models? Because it doesn't really sound that straightforward given the preface that I've provided. So simply put, we cannot change entrenched problems with the same thinking that created them. And we know from the evidence that mental models do fundamentally influence how we define a problem, what we see as viable solutions, and whose voices are prioritised both in the process of defining the problem, coming up with those solutions, and in the implementation of solutions. So this is, it's a good rationale, as well as when we think about the imperative to create transformative systems change, we really need to get to the root of the issue as it is. And so mental models may represent one layer of that. As I've mentioned, we had this wonderful work done by Orange Compass in identifying the current state as well as the desired future state. And so the scope of this project has really been focusing on what are some of the mental models underlying the current state as defined in the systems mapping process, and how might we start to change them to get to the desired future state. So thinking about what that might look like and what is some of the evidence that we can change mental models, and maybe where do we need new evidence or where do we need better implementation of evidence that already is out there. So in terms of our methods to date, what we will be presenting on today is our stage 1 deep dives, which has involved a synthesis of the published evidence, both within Australia and internationally, as well as conducting interviews and focus groups with a range of participants from the general public, families with young children, early child development service providers, subject matter experts, and a specific focus on involving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, which is the piece of work that Jada has led. In stage 2, we will be conducting co-design workshops led by Jada, Adrian, and Yasmin, looking at some workshops to explore implementation recommendations based on the findings of this first stage. So just to give you a bit more of a sense about some of the strengths and limitations of the data sources that we have relied on, we do want to be very transparent around this. Our first step really was to conduct an extensive review of prior work conducted by Frameworks Institute. And if you're not familiar with Frameworks Institute, I highly encourage you to go and look them up. They have done an incredible amount of work and really are one of the only organisations worldwide with established expertise specifically around interrogating mental models. Many of the areas that they have worked on are relevant to the current state in Australia, and they have done some prior work in Australia, which we will speak to shortly. However, a lot of their work has been focused on sort of changing and testing different ways of framing mental models in the US and the UK. So recommendations drawn from those contexts may not necessarily fit with Australia, and that is something that we really acknowledge and is part of what we need to test, through this process. Excuse me. The second data source that we drew into our deep dives was from Australian public opinion surveys, things like the Mapping Social Cohesion Survey, which is incredibly comprehensive and very strong in providing current data from representative samples of the Australian population on issues that are connected both to the current state and the desired future state. But again, we need to recognise that these surveys were not designed for our specific project, unfortunately. And so it does require us to kind of extrapolate those findings and see how they do fit with the mental models that we are investigating. The third thing that we did was conduct a bit of a sentiment analysis of comments on Australian social media campaigns that are linked, again, either to the current state or the desired future state issues. And we found that these insights were very helpful because they allowed us to understand some sentiment around certain issues that goes a bit beyond what people might tell us in interviews. But we do have to acknowledge that social media certainly gives us a fairly polarised view of certain topics a lot of the time, and we can't really know how representative the sentiments are. So just flagging that. The fourth data source, as I mentioned, we conducted interviews and focus groups. We had 53 people, including parents with young children, members of the general public, service providers, and subject matter experts. And these allowed us to really interrogate and do these deep dives into the specific mental models that were at the heart of this project and uncover some of the assumptions underlying current thinking about early child development, as well as a range of different other issues that influence early child development systems and outcomes. But 53 people, we know that these findings do need to be tested with broader and more representative groups. And finally, we did literature reviews in specific areas to better understand the context for certain issues that were raised through our consultation process, and to look specifically at how thinking may have changed over time and get a bit of a sense of some of the conditions that may hold certain mental models in place. Okay, so, and just to flag before we move on, because there is a lot of me talking. please do use the Q&A to ask questions at any point, and we will get to them at the end, but we also have people looking at those, and if you do have questions that can be addressed by our team, they will do that as we move through the presentation. Okay, so to give you some examples, we've mentioned mental models, and I'm sure many of you are thinking, okay, but can you give me an example of what some of these are? So the Frameworks Institute have done some wonderful work identifying major classes of mental models, and these are not mental models that are specific to any particular area, but we often see them being this sort of thinking being applied in different areas. And certainly these three came up again and again throughout our consultation. There they were. So the first one is what has been termed individualism. And this is really the assumption that issues or problems can be characterised as being the result of individual choices, values and behaviours, rather than stemming from broader societal issues. And an extension of this thinking is that the solutions to those problems are also individual level solutions. So an example of that is the idea that poverty is a choice and therefore should be punished or penalised in some way, or that people need to kind of work harder, do more, try better in order to get their way out of it. The second major class of mental models is kind of a form of othering or us versus them thinking. And this is the assumption that another social group, preference or experience is fundamentally different from our own. And so an example that came up from the systems mapping process was this idea that there are good mothers and bad mothers. And what we usually see is that the group that is seen as the other is framed as flawed in some way or less than in some way. The third major class that we have been seeing come up is what frameworks have termed fatalism, which is the assumption that an issue can't be fixed because the problem is too large or complex, or those in charge of solving it are just not motivated or competent enough to do so. And again, an example from the prior work is the idea that big reform in Australia is actually impossible. It's just too hard. Now, when we talk about changing mental models, one of the things that you may hear come up is this idea of the way that we frame issues in our communication strategy. So issue framing refers to the way that a problem or topic is presented or described, which in turn influences how people understand the issue and in turn affects their behaviour. So we know from the evidence that different frames may be required for different audiences and certainly for different issues, and that is really a process of scientific inquiry, is to generate some different frames and to test which ones are most effective if we are interested in shifting people's attitudes or behaviour. But there is ample evidence that demonstrates that changing framing can influence the way that people think about issues, but also the way that they behave through, their support for different policy issues, for example. So this is not the only way that we can change mental models, but it certainly is one with fairly robust evidence behind it. And we do anticipate some other recommendations that may come through our co-design process, and certainly certain other recommendations that have come through the literature, which we will discuss with you today. But this is really a big one, and one that has been investigated in Australia. So I wanted to highlight some of the work that has previously been done in Australia, because I think we all breathe a sigh of relief when researchers say, actually, sometimes there's not a need for more research, there's just a need for better implementation. And that's certainly the case for some mental models, because there has been some excellent work done by the Frameworks Institute in collaboration with the Parenting Research Centre, looking at differences between the early child development sector and public understanding about effective parenting, including what it is, what influences it, what can be done about it, sort of mapping the gaps there, as well as a really rigorous process of developing and testing different frames to see how we can get people on board with supporting parenting initiatives. And data has been collected with, I think, over 15,000 Australians. It's been incredibly robust, and there is clear evidence that communications really need to focus on how policies and practices benefit child development rather than how they promote effective parenting. There are a whole range of reasons why that is the case. But given that we have this really solid evidence that this communication strategy works, We know in this particular example that implementation of this evidence is really key to moving the field forward. There have been some excellent examples of implementation, and there's some really, really helpful resources. And I would encourage you to take a screenshot of this and visit the Parenting Research Centre website just to look at those resources, particularly if you're thinking, oh, this sounds great, I want to know how I can apply it within my organisation or the context in which I work. There's some wonderful suggestions there. There's also been some work done, again, by Frameworks in collaboration with CoLab this time, looking at differences between the early child development sector and public understanding of what influences early child development and learning. And again, who's responsible for it, what can be done about it. Again, a range of recommendations about how we should frame this issue, including the idea that we should actually be linking early child development to child health in order to get the general public engaged and caring about that issue. These are some, sorry, our lights have gone off, sometimes some fairly nuanced distinctions, but they actually are demonstrated to make a difference when talking about how we get people on board with supporting policies and programs around early child development. One of the findings that I did want to draw your attention to, though, from this work is that they found that progress really has been made on increasing public awareness of the science of early child development, but now we need to broaden the narrative. And so I think that's a really encouraging message, but it also gives you a bit of a sense of why we have gone quite broad in the mental models that we have been interrogating. They're not just all specifically about parenting or child development, but they are about the broader issues that impact on the way that systems operate and the lived experience of families navigating within those systems. And we can see here a list of the kind of key themes that we have been interrogating. So we've looked at mental models about children and who is responsible for them and their well-being. We've looked at mental models about the nature of child development and what shapes it. We've looked at mental models about the nature and role of governments. We've looked at mental models about inequities, mental models about racism, mental models about the nature of systems, and mental models about parents and parenting. And I think it's important to note, first of all, that we're not actually going to be able to unpack all of the mental models that we have come across in our consultations. We will be unpacking quite a few of them, though. But also, as we go through these slides, I want to reiterate that the dot points that you will see, they're what people told us. They're not necessarily what we believe, but they are indicative of beliefs either that individuals hold or that individuals believe that society believes. And there is a distinction there, and we will speak to that as we go through, because it has important implications for how we might start to shift some of these mental models. Okay, so the first mental model may not come as much of a surprise, particularly for those who are familiar with the work that has been done previously in this space. But this is the mental model that parents are the primary influence on child development. This mental model really stems from individualistic thinking that proposes that individual choices, so in this case, choices made by parents, are the primary determinant of child outcomes. When they were describing this mental model, people told us mainly about the role of mothers in their child's development. Again, may not be much of a surprise. And they told us that, well, mothers are the primary influence on their child's outcomes. Mums returning to working full time and neglecting their children, and parents are the most important thing for kids. And this is a message that they also receive from a lot of the parenting sector a lot of the time. What we found in our consultations with people was that the connections between broader societal issues and child wellbeing was a lot less clear for families and for the general public. When we spoke to them about the role of government in promoting early child development, the conversations largely centred around provision of education and health services. And while families did raise with us the issue of economic security and how that has been impacting on parents, particularly since COVID, our focus groups really seldom raised how those issues connected to economic security and things like housing security might impact on child development. That link wasn't kind of naturally made there. So a second class of mental model was the idea that children are not a collective responsibility. And this belief, again, is really driven by individualistic thinking. but it sort of links to mental model number 1 in that it draws on this idea, well, children's well-being is primarily the responsibility of their parents. But when they were describing this mental model, people told us the government is not responsible for the difficulties families face. Parents are ultimately responsible for the well-being of their children, and parenting is a private and personal thing. And we see a little bit of a difference between this mental model and mental model number 1 in that in mental model number 1, people told us, well, ECD is not necessarily within the scope of the government's role. In this mental model, people are talking about, even if it was within scope, it's not something that we would feel comfortable accepting. It's not something that we feel is really part of, or that people might see us negatively if we assumed that our children could be looked after by the collective. And I think we really saw that reflected in some of our social media analysis. So what we saw here is kind of an extrapolation of this mental model, which is the idea that parents who expect government support are a burden on society. And we really see this thinking exemplified in these comments. Shouldn't people plan ahead and decide if and how they can afford to have and raise children? Why do I have to pay my taxes for someone who just expects the government, we the taxpayers, to pay for everything? Simple answer to this, bring up your own children. Don't leave it to others and then complain that you have to actually pay for the service they are providing you. It's called living within your means. Greed is the problem, not the government or the early childhood industry. Our sentiment analysis also really highlighted this division in public opinion, where we saw a distinction between people who did see child wellbeing as a social investment and certainly something that was part of the collective responsibility, and people who don't see it that way at all. So the commentary in this area really reflected a kind of blend of individualism. So it's your choice, it's your problem, us versus them thinking. So pitting people who choose to have children versus those who don't. And we see that here. Parents should pay for their own life choices. Why should the taxpayer subsidise others' decisions? Oh dear, surely it's a social investment, not just a personal good. Hospitals, education and transport are social investment. Paying for others' families is just socialism. Pay for your own family. So really interesting distinction there between things like hospitals, education and transport, and child wellbeing and child development. So as I mentioned, we don't have time to go into all of our mental models, but just to sum up some of the other mental models around children, child development and the nature of government, we had the mental model that children are not fully formed humans and therefore they're not naturally connected to adult issues such as social policy. Children are resilient and child development is simple, and by extension, there's not that much that we need to do about it. Government involvement means there's something wrong with you. And here I want to emphasise that one of the first reference points that many people spoke to when we talked about, what does government involvement in early child development means, was a frame around child risk and child protection. And so there was a natural extension to, we're concerned what government involvement means because it means that there's a risk issue here. There's something going wrong. And another mental model to do with the nature of government was the idea that governments can't be trusted. This had quite a few layers to it, but I think it's important to note that this mental model reflects beliefs about governments in general rather than a specific government. So it's just mechanisms of government in general cannot be trusted. There was certainly a sentiment that governments act for themselves and not on behalf of families. Okay, so some possible implications, and I say possible because although these have been documented in some of the literature and they have also been raised in our consultations, we have not tested specifically these mental models in connection with these implications. So I just want to make that very clear. People recognise the importance of early child development, but they don't necessarily see child wellbeing as a social issue. They also think that improving early child development is about educating parents. Governments are not expected by society to act with children's best interests in mind, and children are not seen by society to be a policy priority. Government's role in promoting better early child development outcomes can be met with confusion and suspicion. And we saw certainly recurrently in our consultation, resistance to government initiatives, even where they are backed by strong evidence. And a societal expectation that care for children can and should be handled by families, leading to parents really feeling under pressure and feeling stigmatised when seeking help. Okay, so here's a very short summary of some recommendations for change. And again, this needs to be taken through our co-design process. And I really want to acknowledge that this is the result of some amazing work that has been done, outside of our project by other teams working in this space. So what not to do if we're interested in engaging public support for government investment in early child development? One of the things that we're encouraged not to do is frame children in terms of their future potential or return on investment. And I thought this was really interesting because we hear that argument a lot. And, I trained as a health economist after my initial training, and this was a big rationale. Everything's a good return on investment. That's how you get people excited and interested in it. But why this can be harmful is that it undermines the importance of children in their own right and can reduce them to a means of achieving economic efficiency. It can also invoke the polarised opinion that we saw in our slides about whether promoting early child development contributes to social good or not. A second thing we shouldn't do is use specifiers such as working parents when we're talking about this, because this can really make stereotypes about families who expect the government to pay for everything more salient and invoke that us versus them thinking. So thinking about deserving parents versus non-deserving parents and kind of bring that to the forefront of people's minds. We also shouldn't foreground messages about parents. So leading with messages about parents, again, can invoke us versus them thinking. So those who choose to have children versus everyone else, as well as judgments around good parents versus bad parents, as well as bringing those mental models about children being parents' responsibility to the forefront. So there is some guidance, and there will be a lot more in the report that we will be publishing on this. Now, before we move on into our kind of next category of mental models, I did want to just draw your attention to the content of the slides, just so that people can take care as we choose to engage in this content or not, if it is hurtful or harmful for you in any way. So the following slides do contain deficit-based language that is highly stigmatising. And I want to note that these statements largely represent the lived experience of people from marginalised social and cultural groups, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and those with lived experience of disability. To give voice to those with this lived experience, we have presented it in exactly the way that it was told to us. Where statements were made by people from dominant social and cultural groups, they largely represent perceptions of cultural models, so what people think the majority believe, rather than individual beliefs. A lot of the time people are saying, well, I don't think this, but this is what I believe society believes. And we really encourage you to take care when engaging in this content, particularly if it is close to your own lived experience. Okay, so when we were inquiring broadly about mental models connected to poverty and people who experience poverty, two mental models that are kind of similar but distinct really came to the forefront. The first is the idea that Australia is a meritocracy. So according to this mental model, Australian society is an equal playing field, and this was reflected in beliefs such as with enough hard work, anyone can succeed. Again, we see this framing of poverty as an individual issue with individual solutions, and this is reflected in beliefs such as poverty is the result of bad choices. So in order to fix it, you've just got to make better ones. And beliefs such as poverty is the result of failure to take advantage of opportunities. The second mental model we unearthed, we termed life is tough, deal with it. And this is kind of connected to the idea of the little Aussie battler. According to this mental model, Australians should be prepared to have a go regardless of the odds and refuse to admit defeat in the face of great difficulties. In contrast to the meritocracy model, this mental model doesn't actually assume that everyone has equal opportunity. Rather, it explicitly notes that, yeah, life can be tough, but you need to battle your way through regardless. So according to this mental model, experiencing poverty or receiving welfare support was linked to not being tough enough, slightly different. And an important note with these mental models is that they do really represent kind of individual views of societal perspectives rather than the views of individuals themselves. And we see this represented in national survey data, which actually tells us that very few Australians believe that Australia is a land of economic opportunity. It's not what people individually believe, but it is what people may believe that others believe. So in 2019, the Mapping Social Cohesion Survey found that only 19% of respondents strongly agreed with the statement that Australia is a land of economic opportunity, where in the long run, hard work brings a better life. And in 2022, this figure was down to 14%. And this brings us to a really interesting point, because it may not be what Australians individually believe, but what they believe others believe that influences what they expect and how they behave in relation to social action on poverty. And we kind of see this again reflected in some 2018 survey data from Anglicare Australia, who found that while 62% of people disagree that anyone can work their way out of poverty if they try hard enough, and 80% of people agree that no one deserves to live in poverty, only 52% of people agree that most Australians are sympathetic to those living in poverty. And so that has strong implications for how we might frame some strategies that are designed to address problematic mental models. And it brings the question, where are we getting these ideas from? And I'm sure our audience today probably has some ideas about where these ideas come from. And maybe that gives us some guidance as to where we need to target our strategies if we're serious about changing these mental models. Okay, so another mental model that came up and was sort of brought together different strands of thinking around people who are experiencing inequities is the idea that you get what you deserve. And in understanding this mental model, we really saw that, similar to individualistic models that blame people living in poverty for their socioeconomic circumstances, this mental model blames inequities in child development on things like parental choices and values. So according to this mental model, wealthier parents who live in metropolitan areas have earned their right to more choice and higher quality service just by virtue of where they live, how much they earn, and how educated they are. And in addition to general beliefs about us versus them, this mental model was heavily laden with racist stereotypes. And we see that reflected in beliefs like, you migrants should be grateful to be here, kind of take it as it is, it was your choice, and, deal with it. It's basically the thinking. Okay, another class of mental model that we interrogated connected to the experience of inequity was around the experience of people living with disabilities and how they are viewed in Australian society. We unearthed a whole host of very stigmatising beliefs connected to people and children specifically living with disabilities, which are characterised by the mental model that people with disabilities don't hold equal value in Australian society. And this really encompasses several facets of deficit-based thinking about people with disabilities, including narratives that are quite sympathetically framed, such as you should feel sorry for parents who have a child with a disability. It reflects us versus them thinking, the idea that people with disabilities are flawed or vulnerable or scary. Individualism, so exclusion of people with disabilities is because of the way they are, not because of the way the system is, as well as some fatalism we saw coming through in this area. So people with disabilities are too complicated to provide services to work with, to accommodate in our classrooms, etc., etc. And we can see some examples of specific beliefs here. And I'm going to hand over to Jada to speak to you about the next classes of mental models. And Jada, would you like to just introduce with a bit of a preface? Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. I'd just like to reiterate first that these mental models and examples of how they manifest are from the perspectives of people that we consulted who have extensive lived and worked experience. In particular, I spoke with 6 Aboriginal women from across Western Australia to gain an understanding of mental models in society through the lens of Aboriginal people. Although do note that this is not necessarily going to be representative of everyone's experience and perspectives. So we've also used the term Aboriginal as a collective term throughout the next few slides because this has been reflected for this context as the term most commonly used to sort of stereotype or place an inference on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as a group who are from all different groups and backgrounds. So the following mental models were really largely based on us versus them thinking, where there's the notion of a superior group and way of doing things, as well as being based upon individualistic thinking, where it's suggested that individual choices or behaviours have led to families experiencing inequities in service access or outcomes. So this mental model, White is Right, encompasses various deficit-based narratives surrounding children and families from all culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. It frames Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and ways as less sophisticated than Western thinking and ways, or the word that was used in our consultations was that Aboriginal people and ways are primitive. So examples of what people told us is that Aboriginal people aren't educated, Aboriginal people are dependent on welfare, Aboriginal parents are bad parents, Aboriginal people aren't capable of self-governing, and all Aboriginal children have experienced trauma or domestic violence. These ways of thinking have been expressed by Aboriginal people as how non-Aboriginal people might perceive us. However, some of these might become self-stigmatising within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So narratives around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and ways of being as primitive have been reflected as inconsistent. And to some extent, we see that reflected in evidence from the 2022 Mapping Social Cohesion Survey, which had found that 87% of respondents agreed that it's important for Indigenous histories and cultures to be included in the curriculum, while only 38% of respondents agreed that ethnic minorities in Australia should be given Australian government assistance to maintain their customs and traditions. So you see that sort of inconsistency in narratives here. The next mental model, racism is not a problem, encompasses both denying racism exists as a societal issue, as well as denying personal responsibility for racism and its effects. These aren't mutually exclusive. Someone might appreciate that racism does exist, but they may still deny any sort of personal responsibility to it. And therefore, this mental model also includes racism. Racism is not my problem. So what people told us were that racism doesn't exist. Racism is just a few bad apples. Colonisation was ages ago, get over it. I'm not racist, so it's not my problem, and that the system favours Aboriginal people. So this mental model that racism is inevitable contrasts to the denial mental model, wherein this treats racism as a real immutable phenomenon. However, this one suggests that racism is so entrenched in Australia that any sort of change efforts are going to be unlikely to work. This mental model is underpinned by fatalistic thinking. Beliefs unearthed in our consultations also reflected fear of drawing attention to oneself or being seen as overly politically correct or left-wing when taking a stand against racism. So I won't stand up for racism because people won't change. I'm wasting my time and energy trying to solve this, or I don't want to stand up to racism because I don't want to cause a fuss. The next mental model, racism is warranted, suggests that racism is justified because of perceived characteristics or behaviours of the stigmatised group. So racist stereotypes reflect reality. Aboriginal people and ways are primitive. Aboriginal people are to blame for their problems, and this one was seen as more of an outdated mode of thinking, but that Aboriginal Australians will take our white people's land and or jobs. So an example of how these mental models manifest in Australia is given by a recent study, which found that while parents of Aboriginal children maintain very high expectations of their children across their schooling years, teachers' expectations decrease substantially over the same period. So this reflects lowered expectations about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, which is really significant given the influence that expectations can have on children's aspirations. As reflected in our consultations, these deficit models can sometimes lead to internalised stigma, where one might believe that if that's what they think of me, then that's what I'll be or do. So further from this, in the 2022 Mapping Social Cohesion Survey, they found mixed beliefs around racism. 14% of respondents believed that racism is a very big problem. 47% believed it's a fairly big problem. 37% believed that it's not a very big problem. And 2% believed it's not a problem at all. So there are various implications that stem from these mental models. The support for government action on poverty might be undermined because those who mistakenly assume that others don't share their compassionate values about poverty are less likely to act on them. Pervasive deficit narratives regarding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, people with disabilities, and people from culturally diverse backgrounds undermines their prosperity of these people at every level. And the denial of racism and misunderstanding of systematic racism impedes coordinated action to address it. Here are some of the recommendations for change when addressing mental models about inequities in child development. The strategies we've selected to represent are strategies that address individuals, parents, and then school communities and broader society through the media. So we have changing parental beliefs about investment in child development. So evidence demonstrates that parents from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are less likely to believe that parental investment in children can promote early child development outcomes. These beliefs can be changed through exposure to home visiting programs, for example, with knock-on effects on the parents' behaviour. We have changing educators' expectations of First Nations children, promoting the relationships and communication between parents and teachers, and providing training to teachers helps to address inherent biases that might influence their expectations. We also have changing media representations of First Nations Australians. Here, it's so significant to adopt a positive, strength-based narrative of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the media to work to counteract persistent deficit-based framing. So here are some of the recommendations for change when addressing racism and its impact on children. Calling it what it is, this highlights racism as the problem to be solved rather than focusing on individuals or adjacent social issues. Expanding people's understanding of what racism means. This involves emphasising what structural racism looks like and highlighting differences between individual attitudes and structural racism. And building a sense that change is possible. This involves communicating solutions that address racism and its effects, and additionally expanding people's ideas of what collective action looks like at institutional, community, state, or national levels. So in this section, we've shared the lived experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have had first-hand interactions with these mental models. Our approach is one of truth-telling, which aligns with the courageous conversation norms. And we really commit to presenting these findings with authenticity so that we can truly give a voice to our people and share their experiences to form recommendations for change. These are quite confrontational, but it's really important to acknowledge that people may experience pervasive impacts of these mental models day in, day out, and to not make sure that we are not lessening that experience. So now I'll hand over to Amy to go on to the next set.
Thanks, Jada. Okay, so our next set of mental models really speak to the way that people think about systems. So we have the mental model that systems answer to no one, which really frames systems as complex phenomena that just happen, that no one is responsible for. People really described in our consultations very fatalistic thinking about systems failures. So these were just seen as part and parcel, and it's just the nature of systems, and systems change was really therefore not seen as feasible. We also found that the concept of what actually comprises a system was a fuzzy one, not just with who we consulted with, but also with some of our experts and even within our own team. But people either tended to think in terms of individual services or the system as a very abstract, monolithic construct. So when they were describing the nature of systems, people told us systems just evolve, no one is responsible for them, systems failures are inevitable and unavoidable, The system is an entity unto itself, and it's an out-of-control behemoth. How could anyone keep the systems working together? We also heard the mental model that systems failures are other people's problems. And this really builds on the deeply seated belief that poor developmental outcomes are those people's problems, which has been identified in prior work on mental models in Australia. People told us that government services specifically cater to the other, which was variously described as the average, vulnerable families, or families with risk issues. And accordingly, systems failures were seen as other people's problems, in part because there is an assumption there that those with the means can work around the gaps and inefficiencies in service systems. And in fact, they are very motivated to do so. And that brings us to the mental model that families deserve a choice if they can afford it. So our discussions on service provision revealed a desire to distance oneself from government service provision wherever possible. Whereas government service provision was characterised as catering to the average and addressing baseline needs only, people told us that the market offers a really large range of services and that market-based solutions are really flexible to families' needs and beliefs. Further exploration of this revealed to us that families equated more expensive and more tertiary services with better value and more appropriate care for their family. And so, we explored some of the possible implications of this, and some of this was kind of what you might expect: preference towards market-based systems as a means of providing value and choice to families, this sense of government initiatives being viewed as good enough for some people, but not for me, market systems and failures being viewed as failures of individuals, and people feeling really unable to change the system and either motivated to work harder to make the system work for them or to give up entirely. But this is what we found really interesting when we were digging a bit further, specifically around, what is leading to this kind of persistence of desire around family choice in services, and particularly the kind of motivation to pay for services or to have more expensive services, even when market failures were very apparent, and even when, their beliefs weren't necessarily endorsing the system that reinforces inequity. And what we found was that people's perceptions about societal mental models about inequity and those who experience it create a desire to distance oneself from those people. As we've told you before, we heard people saying, well, government involvement, government services means children are at risk, means government services are good enough for some people, but not for me. I have to earn the right to choose something different. Systems failures are really other people's problems, because if I try hard enough, I can make the system work for me. And a higher cost and more specialised service means a better service. And in this, we saw that something we really didn't expect, if I'm honest. We thought, okay, preference for market-based systems is to do really with what people believe about the nature of markets, maybe about the nature of systems. We didn't anticipate that actually at the heart of it, mental models about inequity and those who experience inequity were really driving a lot of thinking and behaviour around this particular area. So this is something that has really guided us in terms of what we think we need to focus on in the next steps of this work. And I'm going to pass over now to Jada, who's going to wrap up with some mental models around parenting.
So this mental model that parenting is easy takes an individualistic frame towards parenting that suggests it should come naturally and easily to those who are seen as good parents and those seen to love their children enough. It's like people believe parenting is easy, that anyone can do it. Staying at home is easy, and young children can entertain themselves. This mental model, providing care is integral to women's identity and power, frames the provision of care as something that is innate to women. So supporting children is integral to maternal identity. Women enjoy providing care, and child development is the last bastion of women's influence. The mental model that men are not nurturers frames men as providers in contrast to nurturers. And in its extreme forms, it leads to assumptions that men are redundant in direct child-rearing practices or that they are unequipped as parents. Men don't have a natural parenting instinct. Dads don't know what they're doing with children. Dads are not necessary for children's development. So there's various possible implications of these mental models. Some that we have come up with is that the gendered nature of care means that care is devalued across personal and professional settings. Also, that mental models may contribute to the exclusion of fathers from communications about early child development, as well as from policies and programs that are designed to support parents and children. As well as this, they might foster public resistance towards policies that support parents. This particular point has already been a focus for prior mental models work in Australia. Some of the recommendations for change for overcoming the impact of unhelpful mental models about parenting are focusing on how programs benefit children and making explicit connections between parenting and the benefits to children. By framing parenting as a means of achieving better outcomes for children, it's likely to garner support for related policies and programs. Explaining how context impacts parenting involves correcting perceptions around parenting capacity by bringing in social influences. This can really help to counterbalance unhelpful narratives about parental deservingness and responsibility. We also have not using subjective judgments such as effective when communicating about parenting. So rather than suggesting that parenting is innate, drawing attention to the social conditions that affect parenting and explaining how improving these conditions benefits families. So we've explored some of the findings with you and unpacked some of our mental models. Amy will now wrap up and talk about some of the next steps for this work.
Thanks, Jada. Okay, so with so many mental models to focus on, I guess the question for us is, where do we focus our efforts if we are serious about systems change? And I wanted to return to this diagram really to sort of highlight the level of systems change that is about relational change, because this is arguably what we really need to focus on, where we want to see change occur before we look to anything around policies, practices, or resource flows. So our view is that if we are serious about relational change, we need to prioritise addressing the mental models that keep some groups in positions of power while keeping other voices silent. And I think we should mention that we have been encouraged many times throughout this process not to focus on that particular area by some of the people who we've engaged throughout our consultation process. It's either seen as too hard, too difficult to change. We have had many messages kind of which highlight the fact, I suppose, that a lot of our mental models around racism were raised by people with lived experience of being on the receiving end of racism, and much less by people who are more complicit in enacting racism and buying into systemic racism in the day-to-day. And so there was some sort of sentiment that, well, if white people can't see it or don't admit to it, then it's not really there, or it's not really a problem. And we really, I mean, that kind of makes our point even more pertinent, which is that we really need to look at these mental models that rely on us versus them thinking and marginalise the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, people with disabilities, people living in poverty, and people from culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and have them at the table when we are talking not just about, you know, what some of the problems are, but as we are defining the solutions and as we are defining, you know, what is the desired future state, for example. So this is where we really feel that we need to focus. And we wanted to emphasise that, you know, it's not just about what we focus on, but how we focus on these different areas. And through Jada's work and the work that she's done collectively with the people she's engaged through this process, we have a very strong message that racism and inequities need to be treated with care and purpose, using a strengths-based and community-led process. It is really amazing to see where this is being done in a number of ways, and we also know that we have got a long way to go. And we know that this involves leadership and governance through genuine partnership with communities where the conception and all stages of change efforts originate from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and ensuring that the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and culturally and linguistically diverse people from very diverse backgrounds and experience needs to be highlighted across all stages. So just returning to, the beginning and where we started with some of the excellent work that has been done in Australia already. I think as we move forward, we do need to be really clear on where we have an implementation gap versus an evidence gap. There is some excellent research that has been done in Australia that very much speaks to important mental models about child development and about parenting, where the evidence is very clear on what we need to do. And all we need to do is work out how do we implement that evidence. In the broader context, there are many other areas of mental models that are connected to early child development systems and outcomes that haven't necessarily been properly unearthed or tested conclusively in Australia previously. There's some really interesting findings from overseas, but we don't know at the moment whether they make sense for this context. So the co-design workshops that Yasmin, Jada and Adrian will be leading will explore specific recommendations for change in Australia, including implementation strategies, as well as thinking about, how do we go about rigorous testing of framing strategies in some areas. If you are interested in being part of the co-design process, we would encourage you to email backbone@earlyyearscatalyst.org.au. So again, you can take a screenshot of that one. And if you would like to get in touch with either Jada or myself, our emails are on the screen. We are going to have some question and answer time now, but I appreciate we've bombarded you with quite a lot of information. And if you would like to, digest a little bit before you follow up with a question, you are very, very welcome to email us. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to the facilitators of our questions.
Thanks very much, Amy and Jada. Lovely to see you there in stereo. Really appreciate the thoughtfulness. There was some really nice comments coming through on the Q&A, people just acknowledging, and I thought there was just a really fantastic quote there about being a superlative and thought-provoking presentation. So well done. People are obviously enjoying it. Also seeing some really good questions coming through. I guess before we get into some of the practical ones, I do want to pick up something that did come through a little bit. One of the questions is, in reading all of this, we all bring mental models to this work. We bring our own mental models. We live out mental models. We're experiencing the good, bad, and different of mental models, and just even thinking on that racism one, inherent bias that we all bring, and unconscious bias that we'll all bring into this work. Do you want to make any comment about that in terms of us approaching the work as members of this field, as looking at this work, thinking about changing in our mental models and approaching it? Just opening it up to the both of you. You've embedded yourself in this world for all these months, thinking about this, brought this information to us. What do we need to know when we think about that aspect of it?
You want to say something about that, or would you like me to?
You can, I just.
So, I mean, this is something I think about all the time, not just in this project, but it's constantly part of my frame of reference. And I think the best guidance I can give is surround yourself with people who disagree with you on as many things as possible, because that is the best way to get a sense of, where we are making assumptions. And we do it all the time. I think one of my constant learnings in life is not to assume that anybody thinks the same way that I do. It's very unfortunate, but it is a reality. And I think that as we are unpacking mental models specifically, we have to be open to being wrong. And it's not something that experts are very good at doing, is being wrong. We love certainty. we love strategies, we love clear solutions, but often with mental models, you know, experiences are either fundamentally different to what you might expect, or they operate in ways that might surprise you. And we really saw that in our unpacking of mental models about people's beliefs around markets and choice. I remember, Jeff, you saying that, oh, I thought if you focused on that one, that would be a simple one, like there might be a simple solution there. I thought the same thing until we realised that some, you know, deep reservations and some deep stigma around people who experience inequities was driving some of that real commitment to market-based models in the face of, you know, complete, you know, evidence that it wasn't working for them, and even where individuals did not endorse those stigmatizing beliefs themselves. It was just purely about what other people think. So I think that would be my reflection. Jada, anything you want to add?
The thing that I was thinking about would be that in terms of when you might, I guess, just appreciating that people might look at things different ways and being open to having a conversation with someone about that, and being really open-minded as to maybe the reasons why people might look at it a different way, their experiences, and not, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to, there's a couple of really practical questions people are asking. Will the slides be available? Will this recording be available? Yeah, we'll make content available. We just need to do a double check with Amy and the team just around any of the material that might have come from, you know, other sources that needs to be referenced. Yep. Just to make sure that we're really good if we've used anyone, you know, else's IP in the development of this work. We are working on the, well, not we, Amy, Yasmin, Jada, the whole team, they're working this into a full and final report, which gets published in September. That's been mentioned following sort of the next co-design piece of this work, and that's sort of got a lot of in-depth work in it to make sure everything is absolutely tickety-boo. We just wanted to present this as kind of, you know, the end of stage one as we go into engaging with the field. So yes, we'll make lots of material available. We'll email everyone who's in here, and if we do miss your question as well, we'll make sure that we email you and follow you up, because I see there's quite a few coming in. Also, there was just a question about about timings. You know, how do we publish it? It'll all be on the website. So just in terms of those sort of practical things, we'll keep bringing it back there. I want to now go to just a couple of the quick questions that were brought on. You know, there's a lot of comments about, oh, mental models because of this, or, you know, it's no surprise the mental models with the media landscape the way it is. You know, isn't the sort of the economic messaging that we have around this? But there was one comment that I thought really interesting to me, was actually about, you know, some of the comments you made about mental models, about the approaches, are also actually verified through research as having impact. And one person made a comment about mothers and the impact of mothers. And so, you know, the assumption that mothers are the core sort of care delivery vehicle within a family, and that everything centers around that, and you know, the male role models. And you touched on those in terms of, you know, and sometimes we can laugh at a lot of those, but also, you know, there's kind of a lot of evidence in terms of educational outcomes around, you know, the level of education that a mother has experienced in her journey actually has a really significant impact on children in Australian families and their educational achievements. So, I mean, do you want to make any comment about that sort of stuff? Because that kind of reflects the duality, if you like, of these mental models, doesn't it? It's not like there's grains of truth and there's things that have been stretched too far, and you know, there's different aspects to each of these mental models in many cases, isn't there?
Yes, I think if I understand correctly, it's sort of like, well, some of these things are based on scientific truth. So why is it problematic that people do believe that? Is that kind of okay? So yes, I agree. And I think we really heard that, particularly when we were speaking with parents who were just saying, like, I can't take in one more piece of conflicting information about, is it me staying at home with my baby that's the most important thing, or is it me sending them off to ECEC? Because now, you know, that's what I'm being told I have to do. And whatever way you spin it, I feel guilty about it. I think when we are understanding mental models, a piece of this, particularly when we're trying to prioritise mental models to change, is to understand what are the ramifications of thinking this way, and how does that align with certain things that we might want to engender public support for? So if we're interested in engaging the public on certain issues, how do we need to think about which mental models are influencing the way that they think and behave in connection with those specific issues? It's not necessarily saying that all of these are wrong or that they need to be changed. It's understanding where people are coming from and how that is influencing the way that they think and behave. Anything you wanted to add on that topic?
It's just that I think, yeah, when we've talked through this and written up a bit of our work, that, yeah, with a lot of these sorts of recommendations, there does come another side to it. There's ways in which it can benefit certain groups of people, but it might undermine others. So just being really careful and considerate of that throughout.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the mother's question is an interesting one, just in terms of when we are framing communication strategies around parents. I think we also have to think about, even with science, so I was about to say one thing, I'm going off on a different tangent, but we have to think about how assumptions shape the way that we approach science. I think, you know, we love to think about science as an objective truth, but in reality, the way that researchers think has a lot of influence in the process of scientific inquiry. So we just need to be open to that as well. I think when we're kind of, not that I want to stand here and say there are no hard truths in life, but we do need to be open to the idea that maybe even the things that we take as truths, because they are based on evidence, the evidence itself is influenced by mental models.
You're not saying that researchers and academics have mental models, do you?
No, we're all robots.
Great. Look, one of the questions that's actually just comes from here, and I think this is it kind of leads on from that point that you were just making, is, you know, when we gave you the brief for this work, we'd identified some key blockers within the system that were holding the system as it is.
Mm-hmm.
And we said, you know, there's some deep core beliefs within the system that are actually meaning that the system isn't changing. Help us dig into those and how we change them. Therefore, you know, it came from a change model. But there is a question here about, surely there's some mental models that are really good that we need to do more of, that we need to take a strengths-based approach on and build.
Yes.
Do you want to touch on any of those? I know
Yes.
it wasn't sort of the brief of the report, but, you know, given you're here and in this space, do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and I think it would be amazing for us to look at that, particularly as a next step. You know, and it was actually the way that we wanted to approach this in the beginning, was because we felt that it would be more strengths-based and less of a kind of unpacking all the mess. If we were to be able to just focus on what's working well and how do we actually move forward, rather than just kind of look at, you know, the problematic ones that are holding the current conditions in place. However, on reflection and through dialogue with you, Jeff, we decided to focus on the ones that are holding current conditions in place, because we felt that we needed to give voice to a lot of what is often unstated. I think sometimes if you don't, you know, you can look at what's going well and focus on that, but if you don't fully comprehend the reality of what you are dealing with, sometimes those change efforts aren't really going to get to the heart of the matter, and they aren't really going to stick. They can feel a lot more like tokenism, or, you know, the next shiny new thing to say we're all about, you know, doing this, but without actually addressing that. And I think you know, a lot of what has come through this process, as I mentioned, we were encouraged to steer away from, because, you know, people either denied it or they said it was too hard to deal with. But that's exactly why we wanted to focus on it. Did you have anything to add in terms of, you know, helpful mental models that came through your consultations?
I think, yeah, there was a lot of talk around the importance of having strength-based sort of ways of looking at things, and that is such a big part of this. And it was a very big recommendation. I would like to share that and highlight that. Was sort of not that it wasn't what we're doing here. I think that's more of our next steps of this project. So this part is just focusing on our sort of current state issues. But yeah, I think there are so many strengths-based ways of looking at things, and we would really love to dive deeper into that and look at how we can use that to improve ECD outcomes.
I think one more point on that is that what we did have a conversation about very early on was that there were some mental models that were identified in the systems mapping process, and one that sticks in my mind is care is a woman's work, and an extension of that thinking is that is therefore less valuable because it's connected, the gendered nature of care really devalues that care. And we were talking about the differences between Aboriginal and white societies in understanding the role of women in providing care, and talking about how, well, yes, care can be a woman's work and not necessarily need to be devalued when you are coming from a matriarchal worldview. So that was a really interesting example of how you can have the same belief about whose role it is, but not have necessarily negative connotations attached to that belief. And I think there's probably many more examples of that sort of thing that we uncovered through the process.
Thank you. There's a couple of people that have actually stuck up their hands within the panel to answer some questions. So I might just throw it in. Yasmin, you've flagged one of the questions that came in that you wouldn't mind just picking up on. Do you want to go to that one?
Yes, Jeff. Although I found it.
Scrolling back, there's a lot of questions that have come in, hasn't it? Yeah.
So the question was about how early childhood educators can shift mental models, and that they believe they have a big role to play in the mission. And I absolutely agree that in the next stage, where we are doing some design thinking with people from the field, we're looking to speak to people across different sectors. So early childhood education and care, absolutely, community services, policymakers, program developers, and so forth. And I think we'd really like to look together with you at how those mental models can be shifted to address, I guess, the conditions that are holding the current state in place. So Emmy's done a great job of describing that. I'm not going to go over it again, but I just wanted to, I guess, extend an invitation to people to reach out to Jeff through the Backbone email address and to register interest. We're looking at holding those workshops in the next couple of weeks. So if you are interested, do that sooner rather than later, please.
Thanks, Yasmin. There's a couple of questions that have come in saying, how do we track change? How do we know when things are actually changing over time? Like, okay, this is all about how do we develop strategies for change, but how do we know that things have changed? How does that happen? How do we have any sense of it shifting?
Really good question. I would love to know the answer. If anyone has ideas, please, you've got my email address. I think this was one of the first questions that I had, because we do see really nice, neat experimental evidence coming, particularly out of the framework's work and some of the organisations that have been connected to them, like the Parenting Research Centre. But how do we know, when this is implemented in practice, is anything actually changing in terms of people's behaviours? I think it is really helpful to have national and I believe annual survey data through things like Mapping Social Cohesion that show us kind of where the public is sitting on a broad range of social policy issues. I think that's one way of sort of seeing shifts over time. Whether we can track that, in relation to any particular initiative that is introduced to shift mental models is another question, partly because I don't think a single strategy is ever going to comprehensively shift mental models. I think it needs to be a concerted and kind of long-term effort if we are talking about achieving systems change. So yeah, but if people have ideas about where that's been done internationally or within Australia, it would be really, really wonderful to hear. And I think it is something that may be possible to evaluate at maybe the organisational level. That could be something that is, you know, more feasible than thinking about it more at the societal level.
I think as well,
I mean, I've seen a good example. Sorry, Jada, go ahead.
I was just going to add that I think it's important, if you were to sort of measure these shifts and look at how they might have changed over time, is just making sure you're really getting that diverse voice in that, that you're not just asking one group of people, and that you're really getting the experience of many different people from many different contexts and backgrounds.
Yes, I think I totally agree with that.
Yasmin?
I was just going to say, Amy, in terms of the idea of tracking change, I've seen it done quite well at the organisational level in relation to reconciliation action plans. And there's a national group, and their name escapes me right now, that has been tracking that across a number of organisations and providing information back to organisations about what's shifting in their organisation and what's not. And so I think that sort of work might be able to inform how we look at that. But yeah, again, across the whole society, is it shifting policymakers' perceptions of what's important to focus on, etc. I think there's some policy analysis to be done there, and maybe some social research, if anyone wants to put their hand up to fund it.
Thanks, team. We're at the 5-minute bell, so I'm just going to acknowledge the team who put in all the hard work and all the research. Again, reminding everyone that there'll be more updates to come. There's the sort of the co-design work now, which really, and there's probably 3 or 4 questions that have come through, you know, saying, oh, but what about this? How do we join it with this? And how do we do it with this work? And, you know, observing all of the work that's happening in the early years field, the Commonwealth early years strategy, that, you know, there's a lot happening right now. And how do we connect all of this up? How do we connect it with these initiatives? And that is a very live question for us as the early years catalyst as well, in terms of thinking about where does this work go? You know, how's it used? So, you know, encourage everyone to participate in that conversation and welcoming your input, and, you know, make sure you're signed registered. I'm actually going to throw now to Penny, the second co-chair of the Early Years Catalyst. And Penny, I'm going to ask you to walk us out here and wrap us all up with a nice bow with your own reflection of the session. And yeah, again, just thanking the team from TKI and throwing to you, Penny, to finish this off. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jeff. And you ask no small thing to wrap this up neatly with a bow. I guess what I will do is to finish with some observations and then some next steps for us all. I think for me, my primary observation is how deeply, deeply challenging the mental models that were presented were for me as a person, as a woman, as a person who does policy in this environment in Australia at the moment, and to understand what those underpinning mental models that are shaping the way we think, and hopefully will help us to understand how best to take action to work through those mental models, because they are, as Amy pointed out, the things that are holding in place the outcomes, hence the more negative framing. I think also one of the other things that is worth noting is that that concept that even if it's not something that I believe, but because I might believe that the people around me believe it, that has big implications for how I might behave, how my organisation might behave, and how bigger organisations like governments might behave. And I think as we go forward, and as I know there are colleagues on board from many of the big national initiatives and reform processes that are happening, I think that's something for us to be very mindful of as we shape strategies and responses to strategies. So I think that was a great finding, and thanks so much, Amy, for pointing that out. I just wanted to, I guess, pull out that issue of risk. I think that was something that was, again, not surprised by, but I think we need to be much more cognizant of. If risk, and if we're associating governments and government intervention with risk, then I think we have to have a different framing of risk to pick up on the framing language going forward. And I would like to ask the question about whose risk to whom, because are we talking about risk to responsibility holders, risk to the service system, or are we actually talking about risk to children and families and opportunity costs that are inherent in risk? My other observations were really around that notion of relational change as you described it. And I guess I want to leave the group with one key question, drawing on Amy's thoughts. How do we make those silent voices loud voices? How do we make sure that when we're doing the work, when we're looking at responding in the right ways to these mental models, how do we make sure that the voices that are in our society that are often silent, that are often marginalised, that we don't get to hear from, how do we elevate those voices and the processes that we run in order to be able to do that reform work? And I think that's a challenge for all of us, whatever role we play in the ecosystem. And then finally, I want to go back to that notion of implementation gaps. And again, your point, Amy, and as my colleague Michael refers to it, is this issue we have in Australia with the difference between knowing and doing. And how do we take what we know and how do we use that in really meaningful ways and not pretend that we don't know. So I guess that's my call to the group, and I guess it reinforces that invitation to join us at the Catalyst in this next phase of co-design, because we know that the people on this call today have vast depths of knowledge across all of the service systems that interplay in the early years. And what we need from you is to bring your knowledge, bring your knowing, so that we and all of the processes that we're hoping to influence this work can actually do better. And I think that's we're all beholden to make that contribution in this space. So noting the time, I just want to thank again the team for the work that you've done. It's a really amazing piece of research. And on behalf of Jane and myself and the Backbone team, Jeff, particularly, thank you for your time this afternoon. It's been fabulous having you. If you're keen to keep involved, all the details have been put into the chat and the Q&A, and we look forward to going on this mental models journey with you further. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.